So everyone, I want to welcome everybody for being here today. Excited about our next presenter that we have this month, Catherine Foreman-Gray, and we have Dave Kennedy, who is the curator of collections and exhibits here today. He's from the U.S. Marshals Museum. And before he gets started, there is something I want to talk about with our partnership with the U.S. Marshals Museum. They've been an excellent partner with Cherokee Nation. There's a lot of stories. I'm sure David's going to go through them a little bit today, but there's a lot of stories that involve Cherokee Nation, jurisdictional conflicts, and they've been excellent to work with and to make sure that our story and our side of the story is told. So I want to thank the Marshals Museum for that. Before we get started, everybody please help yourself to food. The restrooms are located behind you and to my left. And so if you need to use the restrooms, that's where they are, through the glass doors. And I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Again, I want to welcome Dave Kennedy. He's with the U.S. Marshals Museum, and he is the curator of collections and exhibits.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. To reiterate what Catherine was talking about, the Cherokee Nation has been just the biggest partner with a lot of the stuff that we've done at the Marshals Museum. Anytime as we were going through researching the history, researching the stories, trying to figure out some of the things that we're going to be putting into our exhibits, that I'll be showing you some stuff here. Anytime that we needed to make sure that we had the appropriate voice, Catherine was one of those people that we reached out to. Because really, and to be honest, almost everybody on the crew, whether at Marshals Museum, at United States Marshal Service headquarters, at Thinkwell Group, the company we worked with to make sure that our vision ended up being realized, a lot of those faces look like this. And we recognized that we didn't have the experience, we didn't have the voice to be able to be authentic to some of these stories. We knew the facts and the dates and the people involved in the stories we wanted to tell, but we also knew that we weren't necessarily the authorities. We weren't coming from a position of authority. We weren't coming from a position of experience, having been descended from the people who are involved in these stories. And so we wanted to make sure that we were being very respectful to the stories, to the people involved, very definitely to like Cherokee Nation, or in some of the other nations within the 5 tribes, just a number of things we were wanting to say, and just the different peoples who are involved. So with that, and you're going to be seeing some of the stuff that Cherokee Nation helped with on this. I did kind of turn this to focus a little bit on the role of Cherokee Nation as part of what we tell in our stories, but I very definitely wanted to tell a little bit about the Marshals Museum, who we are, what it is we're doing, and the stories that we're telling. And with that, a little bit of history first about the Marshals, because a lot of people don't know who the United States Marshals are. The United States Marshals Service as an agency has only existed for about 50 plus years. The Office of United States Marshal was one of the very first things that the fledgling American government created in 1789. They knew that one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation prior to that was that the federal judiciary, well, not even the federal, but the courts had no teeth. They couldn't make the many states of that confederation do anything. If you committed a crime, or if you did something against a contract against me and you're in New Jersey and I'm in New York, there's no way for me to get any money back from you. The central government couldn't force any of the subsidiary states to provide troops or money for things. And so as a result of that, they went through, they developed the Constitution, and so, which we all know today. And one of the very first things that that Constitution did in Article 3 is it says, here's the Supreme Court, Congress is going to figure out everything else afterwards. And that's exactly what they did. The first thing, as soon as they got a quorum, the Senate sends off a committee. They do, like, it's one of those things we're not used to Congress actually getting things done sometimes. Everybody's favorite thing in the world is discussions of American legislative system. They go off, and the very first thing that they came back with ends up becoming what in today's term would be Senate Bill number 1 of the first United States Congress. That's the Judiciary Act of 1789. It does a number of things, creates our modern, what's still our modern court system, our federal courts. We are in the Eastern District of Oklahoma over here. You go over to the other side of the state line, and you're in the Western District of Arkansas. You go over towards Tulsa, you're in the Northern District of Oklahoma. There's some states have 1 district, some states have 4 districts. Each of those districts, though, has 2 officers that are presidentially appointed and approved by Congress: United States Attorney and the United States Marshal. That Marshal is the teeth for the federal judiciary. Their job is not, even though it's politically appointed, their job is not to a political party. Their job is to the American government, to the federal court system, to the Constitution, to the rule of law. Their job is not to do whatever this Republican or Democratic president in the White House wants. Their job is to do what the federal court says, what the federal judge says, what the Supreme Court says. And so quite often that leads to them being involved in jobs that are very important, and many times it requires them to do jobs that they don't personally agree with. There were deputy marshals who didn't want to escort young black children to schools in New Orleans. There were marshals equally, 100 years before that, who didn't want to return fugitive slaves to the South because they were abolitionists. There are people today who are deputies who don't want to stand out and guard women's health clinics. There's a long history of people going out and doing things they don't want to do, but because they hold that allegiance to the rule of law. So to get on with this, though, so it's the oldest law enforcement in the country. The history of our organization is in 1989, for the bicentennial of the Marshals Service. They decided that they were going to have a traveling exhibit worked up with the Smithsonian that went around to about 14 different locations in the country over 1989, 1990, 91, 92. And as part of that, it traveled around the country in different places. By the time they got done, they realized they want to have some place that is going to be a semi-permanent home. So they found a location, the State Territorial Prison Museum in Laramie, Wyoming. They had that home there for about 6 years, and they started to realize that that organization was not doing what they were supposed to do. So they decided, we're going to remove that. And so, long drawn out process involving a federal lawsuit, because they didn't want to give up the Territorial Museum didn't want to give up the good thing they had. There was an attempt at a Marshals Memorial over in Oklahoma City, over across the road from the Cowboy Hall of Fame. That didn't pan out. But as a result of those 2 failures, the Marshals decided, we need to have a permanent museum. We need somebody else to figure out where to go, how to do it, what to do. And they did a nationwide search. More than 100 cities and towns submitted responses. The final 2 ended up being a suburb of Washington, D.C., and Fort Smith, Arkansas. And so where are you going to put a federal museum? Of course, you're going to put it outside of Washington, D.C. That's what everybody in the Marshals Service thought until they came to Fort Smith. And they met a number of people, literally more than 1,000 people, whose ancestors were deputies, whose ancestors were the bad guys that the deputies were going after. They met people who were very excited about this story, and they were very tied to what a lot of people think of. Like if I were to poll this room, I would fully expect that the largest response, if I said, what makes you think of the Marshals? The first thing a lot of people are going to say is true grit. And that story of true grit, of hang 'em high, of the Western Marshal riding out of Judge Parker's court into Indian Territory, what's now Cherokee Nation, Choctaw Nation, Chickasaw Creek, is a lot of what a lot of people think in their heads. And so that's part of why I ended up at Fort Smith. And so Fort Smith was selected in 2008. The problems were nobody who was involved in the process in Fort Smith came from the museum field. So over a couple of years of City of Fort Smith and the University of Arkansas at Fort Smith working together, there were a number of people who realized we need to find some professionals who are not the university and not the city government to figure out how to do this, because they're just sitting there treading in the water. So they hired several people who had some nonprofit experience, a little bit of education experience, and the interest in museums to start working this. Over the last 15 years, the money's been raised, attempts have been made to try to get the property, to get the design, to get everything running, and those decisions were made, leading to where we finally opened up this last July 1st in Fort Smith. And this right here was an early design and what still a lot of people in this region think the museum was going to look like. It's a little bit too futuristic, and there's not one right angle in the building except for the front doors. But so we ended up, we redesigned for a cheaper building, and we also ended up being placed on a spot right on the Arkansas River. You can look across the Arkansas River right into Oklahoma. Just the same view a lot of the deputies might have had going into Indian Territory. And a little bit about this statue, my personal favorite picture of it. It's called the Light Horseman. It is by an artist, Cherokee and I believe Osage.
Pawnee.
Oh, Pawnee. Mm-hmm. And so this is Daniel Horsechief, and he is a native artist. He has a number of statues and other art around the state. And Daniel is very rightly proud of this particular statue. This was given to the museum by the 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma, the combined 5 tribes that moved in, were relocated during the 1830s and 40s. And so we're very proud to have that there. That's there to help symbolize and memorialize the many law enforcement who were in the 5 tribes. And it's one of the things we have to try to get people to understand when they come to the museum is that the marshals were not there to provide law enforcement in the Indian Territory. Each of the tribes had their own legal systems, they had their own law enforcement. They had been taking care of themselves quite well, thank you. When they were back east, they were still doing that now that they were out west. And the Light Horse were these law enforcement officers. And they were there to exercise the law within the legal systems of the 5 tribes. And the marshals were there to exercise federal law and to do anything that involved United States citizens. And quite often, the Light Horse were there. Many of them ended up being cross-deputized as Deputy United States Marshals in their own right. Many of them worked with deputies, because if I'm a deputy riding out of Fort Smith and I'm going into Cherokee or Choctaw or Chickasaw Creek Nation, and I don't know that area, I'm not sure I know which guy I'm looking for. I might know a name or a description, but I do know this Light Horse officer who lives in this town, and I figure he probably knows this guy. So I'll show up, I'll have my posse, we meet this guy, say, hey, I'm looking for John Smith. He looks like this. Oh yeah, I know him. He's over there. He's hanging out with the Jones brothers. We've been wanting them too. Let's all go together. And then so you get the beginnings of what today are Marshals Task Forces. And quite often the Light Horse, there's a number of them in our Hall of Honor, which I'll discuss next. There's a number of them who ended up either arresting or ending up killing the guys who had killed deputy marshals. And so there was really a tight partnership between them. And so here is our Hall of Honor that when you're standing in this space, you look out the window and there is that statue of the Light Horseman. Our Hall of Honor is a memorial space that now unfortunately we increased 4 more over the last couple weeks. We recognize currently 392 men and women who gave their lives in the line of duty to the mission of the Marshals. These are anybody from the first marshal to get killed in the line of duty in 1794 all the way up to, as I said just a couple weeks ago, in North Carolina. These are people who literally just rode out of the court, had to go serve a warrant. They might have gotten injured transporting prisoners. They might have gotten injured on their way to provide some sort of service for the court. And these are, there's there's a large number of them from around the country, but the vast majority, not the vast majority, about a third of them are from within what's now Oklahoma. And it's partially because of that reason that Stacy Hilton, the former director of the Marshals Service, referred to our location as sacred ground for the Marshals Service, simply because of the number of people whose lives were lost here. There's probably more deputies buried in Fort Smith and more deputies killed within a 50-mile radius of Muskogee than anywhere else in the country. Specifically to the Cherokee Nation, there are 8 names, if I remember correctly, that are Cherokee. No, 9 names that are Cherokee. Anybody who's serious on Cherokee history, you'll recognize the date behind this particular slide. This is 1872. This is in the middle of April. This was the Going Snake fight, which took place about a half-hour's drive from here.
About that, yeah.
Yeah, head over to Stillwell, go north towards Christie, and you'll see an open field where I believe there's one of the buildings where that shooting took place. This essentially, for many, many years, and I'll talk a little bit more about Going Snake in a bit, but for many years, there have been about 3 or 4 different popular understandings of what happened there. And I think very much as a result of the work that we did in the way of research to make sure that our story was correct, the work that we did with Cherokee Nation to make sure that everybody was agreeing on timelines and who was involved and why they were involved and what they were doing. I think we've reached a much better understanding, a much more accurate understanding of what occurred, where these 3 Becks and this gentleman, George Selvage, who was married, he was an intermarried citizen, these 4 were riding along as posse, but really these are 4 people who were associated with the deceased in a murder case, and they were wanting all they could do in the way of what they thought is justice. And I know there's still members of the Beck family here in the region. I know there's still members of the Proctor family still here in the region, and they all still have very strong feelings, and I understand that entirely. All we can do is try to get a better understanding of that story, and I know that it's one of those things we've worked very hard with Cherokee Nation to make sure we're doing that and telling it correctly. For those of you who are on the bus tour, I think you guys are going over to the History Museum later. There's very probably something over there specifically about Going Snake that'll give you a better idea on that than I could hear in about a 5-minute period. We've got, you jump forward about 15 years, and you've got Henry Miller and Sam Sixkiller who are killed within a year of each other. Henry Miller was a guard who was helping a deputy in his posse. They needed one more person just to kind of watch this guy. The guy in question had been arrested for importing alcohol. That was the majority of the arrests that were made in Indian Territory. Stuff related to alcohol, importing, selling, producing, which was not legal in this area. So he's sitting there at tending the campfire. He needs to get some wood, and the marshal, the deputy, and the posseman had to go off and get somebody else. They come back later. The guy he's guarding, apparently, they found out later, since he wasn't really considered a threat by Henry Miller just went ahead, untied him, said, "Here, can you take this axe and help me cut up some wood?" Yeah, that's, they found the axe later. Sam Sixkiller, on the other hand, very well known in Cherokee history. He was very important. He ended up, by the 1880s, he was the chief, he was the captain for the U.S. Indian Police, which had jurisdiction across Indian Territory. He was also cross-deputized as Deputy United States Marshal. He was also recognized as a security guy for the railroad that was coming through. After a couple of different back and forths with some ne'er-do-wells here in the area, he ended up getting involved in a shootout, injured one of them. That guy ended up dying of an infection because of how he got shot. And one of his buddies always blamed that guy's death on Sam Sixkiller. Later on, he finds and gets involved in the shootout with Sam Sixkiller and kills him. But he was still seen today as one of the more important people in the way of law enforcement in this region. Jim Nakedhead, 1895, He went out as a deputy. He was also U.S. Indian Police, cross-deputized across the two of them, so he had multiple jurisdictions. He goes out and they go to chase somebody down. He and a group of other law enforcement, they go to get the guy out of the house. He comes running out of the house, shooting as he comes, and just a snapshot and shoots and kills Jim Nakedhead just immediately. Ike Rogers, did anybody here watch the Bass Reeves Lawman TV series? Okay. I'd like to both recommend and not recommend that you watch that, just simply because that series has a number of very, very fanciful tales that they tell about Bass Reeves. But one of the characters that shows up in there is a guy named Ike Rogers. Ike Rogers is a guy who is a Cherokee freedman. He ended up becoming a deputy, and he ended up being relatively important as law enforcement in the area. He ends up, because of a relationship, goes after a guy named Cherokee Bill, who was one of the more famous bad guys in the area. His cousin, Cherokee Bill was kind of sweet on her, and he knows that. He gets her to show up at a particular house, brings Cherokee Bill along. They show up, Cherokee Bill walks in, Ike Rogers, among a couple of other guys, arrests Cherokee Bill, takes him back to Fort Smith. He goes to jail there, tries to escape, gets caught, gets tried again for the murder that took place during that, and ends up getting hung in Fort Smith. One of his brothers blamed Ike Rogers for basically not being fair about this whole thing, being a little bit too sneaky, and he goes and assassinates Ike Rogers. Says that he ever shows up, I think it was here in Tahlequah, if he ever shows up again, I'm sorry, it was over in Fort Gibson. If he ever shows up again, he's going to kill him. Ike Rogers goes over, steps off the train, goes to shake somebody's hand. The guy comes up, puts the gun right in his face and shoots him. Charles Warner was a deputy in the 1930s. He was a Cherokee, about quarter Cherokee citizen. He was born in Missouri, but had moved back and forth, lived quite a bit in Oklahoma. He and a number of other guys went out after some train robbers, and they end up, as part of this shootout, he gets shot in the arm. They go to the doctor, think nothing of it. 2 or 3 years later, he dies of his wounds because his arm had gotten all infected inside, and the doctors ended up nailing it down that it's a result of how he got shot and where he got shot in the arm 2 or 3 years prior. So you've got those names here. Before I forget, one of the things that came as a result of the killing of Sam Sixkiller, federal law was passed as a result of his death. That federal law made it a felony to kill a federal law enforcement officer. Prior to that, if you killed a federal law enforcement officer, it was a charge, it was murder, but now as a result of this, they would end up throwing on an additional charge, partially because he was also U.S. Indian Police, partially because he was a tribal citizen. Because he was a tribal citizen, if it was a U.S. citizen, normally you would read just like somebody who looks like this, had gone out and killed him, that would end up getting tried in a federal court. If it was a Cherokee or other native citizen, they would get tried in a tribal court. And so they wanted to make sure that this was going to be a federal charge and that there would be an appropriate, if that were to happen again, there would be an appropriate resolution of the case. So the museum itself, some people like seeing designs. I like to throw designs up there for it. We do talk about a lot of these different topics. When you walk in from our main gallery, you go to Be a Marshal, which is a lot of the basics about the Marshals. You see a timeline, you see a lot of the information to help people understand the wide variety. Some people call the Marshals the other duties agency. If it doesn't fit under FBI or the Treasury Department or Customs or whoever, it'll fall over to the Marshals. You come to the campfire, which is kind of the hub on our wagon wheel. There's some different stories that go on there. You'll see a photograph of that here in a second. From there, you can either go out to Frontier Marshals, which a lot of people think that our entire museum is going to be about. They don't realize that the Marshals took place over a much longer time span than just 20 years of the Old West. And so we talk about the Frontier Marshals from when the frontier was the Ohio River Valley up until about Oklahoma statehood in 1907. You can go to A Changing Nation, which really talks about our entire history as a country. The Changing Nation is about really how that country has changed. It's what I think of as Marshall's history is American history. American history is Marshall's history. Nothing major has ever happened, nothing important has ever happened in American history that the Marshalls were not part of. Whatever the event, the Marshalls had something to do with it. If you want to look at COVID, who was manning the COVID hotels on both coasts as people had to go through their quarantine for 2 weeks prior to entering the rest of the country? When the first COVID vaccines were shipped out from the pharmaceutical plants, the Marshalls were escorting it. If there is an issue about, almost since the beginning of the nation, if there's a question about the safety of an election and whether or not people are going to be trying to threaten other people, this was a huge thing during the 1870s, 1880s. There were marshals involved in almost every election across the country just to be there to make sure that nobody was trying to influence any of the elections. And so there's a lot of those different stories. We talk about the civil rights, we talk about anti-government activity, we talk about the role the marshals take at just any major crisis. And then we talk about modern marshals, which focuses on really about the last 50 years. As our country has changed, as crime has changed, as technology has changed, and we work into that. So much nicer view of that. If you turn that all upside down, you've got our entry going through, getting into to be a marshal, campfire, frontier marshals, changing nation, and modern marshals on this side. And so when you come to the museum, in addition to this, so this is the entryway. You go through this stylized badge into to be a marshal. So we have this courthouse scene, have a timeline. You can go from here into the campfire scene. You see these four figures doing what law enforcement everywhere around the world will do. You get 2 or 3 guys men or women sitting together. What do? They start telling stories. Hopefully most of those stories are going to be true. Our stories are all true. We have them representing 4 different eras in American history, and they're telling stories from that time, whether you're talking about Robert Forsyth being gunned down in 1794, whether you're talking about the first woman to be a deputy in the United States Marshal in St. Louis in the 1880s, whether you're talking about escorting young girls into schools in New Orleans in the 1960. If you are talking about, who here remembers Tiger King a couple of years ago? Okay, so Tiger King, he goes off to prison. The people who he left behind to take care of his place, they didn't do too good of a job, and they were breaking some different fish and game, U.S. fish and game laws. The federal court said, okay, all of those cats need to go someplace. Who's that fall to? The marshals. So you end up having about half a dozen deputies from Oklahoma City, some guys from Fish and Wildlife, some other folks who know what they're doing. They had to go in, they had to get every last one of those cats, lions, tigers, any other thing that they had there, cage them up, get them out to other shelters and rehouse them elsewhere around the country. Again, it's just the Other Duties Agency. If you go to the Old West, we definitely talk about Bass Reeves. Bass Reeves very much has become the archetype for a lot of Western deputies. We consider him to be the most prolific law enforcement officer the country has seen. He was involved with the Office of Marshal for about 35 years. Some of that as a posse man, some of that as a deputy. One of my nicknames my boss has for me is I'm the crusher of dreams, because people come in and they have really good stories about people like Bass Reeves, and I'm like, yeah, that didn't actually happen that way. And so I have to kind of tell them some of their facts behind what they see as a Facebook meme. And so we have some interesting stuff there regarding Bass Reeves. We talk about the stories of them. We talk about also in this area, the comment earlier, there was someone that made the comment about the Trail of Tears. The Marshals weren't involved with the Trail of Tears, but it's very much directly a result of the Trail of Tears that the Marshals are in Fort Smith. It's very much a direct result of how the federal government set up Indian Territory. It's one of the only territorial areas within the United States that Congress did not make able to, like, they didn't give them the ability to take care of themselves the way that they did with Illinois Territory, Dakota Territory, or Montana Territory, or any Arizona Territory, any of that, when those were created, or at Oklahoma Territory even. They didn't give them the right to have their own federal courts there in the state. They didn't give them the right of their own self-government. They left that all under Arkansas. And so the ability for them to do that, the law enforcement that would have been there otherwise, as you would see in some place like the Dakotas, it was not there. So that left the tribal members to be able to take care of themselves with the light horse. The marshals were there to enforce any of the federal law. And quite often, like if it was like many crimes that would have normally been taken care of by other people, by a local county, like a local sheriff or city marshal, they were being taken care of by the marshals. Crimes like murders, assaults, rapes, things like that, that would have been taken care of by local law enforcement, they were having to take care of it. And so we talk also about Going Snake. We have a small theater that tells the story of Going Snake in 3 acts. It runs over about 12, 15 minutes. And it's really a difficult story to get down to these simple points. But one of the great things, one of the ways that we knew we succeeded is when several recognized experts on Cherokee history came through, and yes, several of them had been involved at different points along the line with our development of this. They came through, they saw this. The only questions one person had, was it, Catherine, was it Jack Baker? Had the comment about the fact that we called Jim Kesperson a U.S. citizen, a U.S. citizen who had settled into the nation, not an intermarried citizen, which for those of you who are from within the nation, you understand the importance of the term intermarried citizen. And the problem is 99% of the people who come through this museum will not recognize that term and will not understand that term. So if we were to say intermarried citizen on the board, we would have to have like a little asterisk and then explain in a paragraph what an intermarried citizen was. And so we're very happy with how that's turned out. One of the neat things that we have there in that space is the Spencer carbine that Zeke Parker was carrying that day. This is a guy who was being tried for murder in a Cherokee Nation court, and his own personal rifle was leaned up in the corner behind him. It's just a different thing. But I could go on, and Catherine can probably vouch for this, I could go on for more than an hour about this story, and actually I did a couple of different times. If you go to the Facebook page for the United States Marshals Museum, there's a long series of videos that I've done as Facebook Lives over the years, and there's at least 2 of them about Going Snake. One of them I think was over an hour, hour and a half long. I couldn't hardly speak by the time I got done with it. Also, if you're in the West, you've got to tell stories. You're going to do that in a saloon. So we've got a card game to test your trivia knowledge, and we also have a magic bartender back in behind the bar to help talk about some different stories across the history of the West, of the Marshals. And then we've got In a Changing Nation. This is one of the galleries over In a Changing Nation. We talk about their responses to disasters and maintaining order. We talk about ensuring the rights for everyone as are described by law. And so while here in this gallery, we do talk about enforcing the Civil Rights Act, enforcing the Supreme Court decision like Brown versus Board of Education, we also in that same space recognize that the Marshals were also the organization that had to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. And so we are more than willing to acknowledge that this organization has not always been on what we today consider to be the side of right, but they were on the side that if this is what the federal law says, if this is what the courts say, this is what we have to do. And is, in the words of Al Butler, a deputy who was at New Orleans, who was at Ole Miss, who was at the Pentagon riots, you put on the badge, you do the job. It doesn't really, essentially, it doesn't really matter what you personally believe. But this is one of those things where if the court says you have to do this in this way, that's what you have to do. In this area, we also talk about people who have personal beliefs that may conflict with what federal courts say and what the law says. and how the marshals have had to go and enforce things. And that deals with all the way back to the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania in 1794, all the way up to dealing with today's modern anti-tax protesters, sovereign citizens, different folks like that. This is in our maintaining order, dealing with protests, with riots, things like labor disputes, coal mine. Like I grew up in an area of the country with coal mines, and so there's definitely been some labor disputes with coal mines, and the marshals have had to be there on both sides. There's 9/11 and the response to that. Most people don't know the marshals took over about 13 or 14 major American airports to ensure that their operations were safe and secure. Let me get into modern marshals, where we really talk about the last 50-ish years, and we talk about a number of different things. The cases that really made the modern marshals what they are today. I consider the mid-20th century to be kind of the bad old days, where with the creation of the FBI, with the creation of Prohibition, and then later ATF, with the creation of Customs and Border Enforcement, with immigration, with all those different agencies doing all these different jobs, that a lot of this ended up getting pulled away from the marshals, that the marshals were essentially being treated as just glorified bailiffs by a lot of people. And so about early 1970s, that's when the marshals really fully got back into hunting fugitives. And these materials, if you remember, anybody who remembers the film The Falcon and the Snowman from back in the 80s, or any of the stuff about Christopher Boyce, these are the handcuffs that were placed on Christopher Boyce after he'd escaped from prison, started going around robbing banks with some guys, and then they finally caught him in Washington State. And it was the marshals who did that. And it was really that arrest that really propelled the marshals into their current modern role as fugitive hunters, in addition to being the people who go after the people who end up just enforcing all the federal court laws. We have a spot in there where we show people kind of like some of the skills it takes to become deputies. We also have one of my favorite parts of this entire exhibit is in their own voices. It is right now more than 100 videos between a minute and 5 minutes long that are from oral histories with the real people who did this job over the last, in some cases, 50, 60 years, telling stories about them doing this job, whether it was as there's one deputy who, as a young black man, had to escort the federal prisoner who had assassinated his hero, Martin Luther King Jr., when that assassin had to go and testify in front of Congress. And it was his responsibility to possibly hazard the safety of his own life to safeguard the life of this individual. You have deputies just telling the craziest stories about bringing back Manuel Noriega from Panama, going down to Puerto Rico for different things, being in other, there's one guy telling a story about a prisoner, doing a prisoner transfer from Europe, bringing him back to the United States, and while they're on the plane, somebody else on the plane started to cause a fight up in a different class section, and he had to go and do that while trusting the prisoner that he was with was going to stay there in his chair. And it was just a lot of really good stories. Women talking about having to argue with federal court judges as to why it was not really smart for them as a deputy marshal to have to wear a skirt or a dress in court or like on the job regularly, because there are times that they would have to do stuff where that would make them unsafe, or just would otherwise restrict their actions. I mean, really just some amazing stuff. We also have, you can just see the corner of it on there, 15 Most Wanted for the Marshal Service. That list has been around for about 20 years now, 25 years. There have been about 5 or 6 of them caught since the museum opened. I cannot wait until somebody is caught simply because somebody walking through the museum saw that and recognized, wait, isn't that the guy who was next in the cabana next to us down at Mazatlan? Or like, isn't that the guy who mows the lawn over the Joneses? I'm fully expecting that's going to happen. And as Catherine was suggesting, this relationship with Cherokee Nation continues. We are Cherokee. This is an exhibit that's been around for a year and a half. And it's been to a couple of other locations. It was here in Cherokee Nation. It was up in Tulsa, I believe.
and we just now opened it this last week at the museum. This is going to be open at the museum until January, and this is a story about Cherokee freedmen. And so we have in there, we have in nice big print on the walls, all the Cherokee freedmen who are listed on the rolls. We have artwork by them. We have artwork recognizing them. We have their stories about them and their ancestors. I mean, really, it's an amazing exhibit. And if you get a chance to run over to Fort Smith, I mean, it's worth it for this, if not for the rest of the other 18,000 square feet of exhibits that you're going to run into. So we're really excited to have this here. And it's just having the Chief Hoskin over at the museum last Friday. That was always a pleasure to have him over there. But I know I've just kind of gone rapid fire through a lot of stuff about the museum, and hopefully you've learned a little bit about the museum. There's a little bit about the stories that we tell, a little bit about how we got those stories told. If anybody has any questions, before I forget, on a lot of the tables I left some stuff, both rack cards about the museum, as well as there's information on there about memberships on a few tables. There's information about group tours on a few tables. We love having people through. I also like to remind people there's definitely ways that you can save money coming to the museum. I know a lot of people, when they show up at the museum, I've been doing this for 20 years. A lot of people show up at museums and they're like, why does it cost so much? There's ways to make sure it doesn't cost so much. So we've got lots of things like that. If you have any questions, I would be more than happy to entertain any of the questions you might have. Some of the misconceptions, oh dear Lord, I could write a book and I need to sit down and actually do write this book. Some of the misconceptions, there's more that we don't know about bass than we do know. There's a lot of things that are treated as solid fact that are based in some cases on problematic family history and family memory. There's some stories that were told that were blown completely out of just completely out. And one of the things as we start to get in, and part of it is because we get into more archives, we get into more studies, and as much as like papers bore some people because they want to see the cool stuff. The papers that we've seen in archives, Bass Reeves did not become a deputy in 1875. This is based on my research. Bass Reeves becomes a posse man in 1876. And he's working in the federal court system over in Fort Smith during that time frame from 1876 up through about 1882. 1882 is the first time we find a reference to him being called Deputy United States Marshal, and the first time there's a mention of him actually taking an oath as a Deputy United States Marshal. Beyond that, especially if anybody watched the Lawman Bass Reeves TV series, it makes it look like the murder of his camp cook was just like a moment of rage, and he'd been having all kinds of delusions, or just he'd been having a bad time or something. And then the court case takes place over the space of a couple of weeks, is how you would look at that in the show. In real life, he kills the camp cook in spring of 1884. 2 years, nothing happens. And so you figure that it was pretty much, it sounds like it was an accident based on all the testimony from everyone. 2 years, nothing happens. Political parties change hands in the White House. A new U.S. Marshal and a new U.S. Attorney are appointed for Fort Smith. Suddenly, magically, he's brought up on charges for murder. He has, for that whole time frame then, from 1886, from January of 86 when he's arrested until October of 1887, he is in the midst of his court case. He spent at least a few weeks of that in the federal jail at Fort Smith, in the holding tank with everybody else, a bunch of guys who some of them he'd probably put away. He ends up, finally gets bailed out. His legal team are former United States attorney and a couple of other guys who essentially, these three are the powerhouse attorneys within Fort Smith. And he ends up, as much as if you committed murder today and you got the best attorneys in your city to defend you, you're going to go broke in a big way. And he ends up having to sell his home. He ends up being out of work. Prior to this, he'd been one of the busiest, best paid deputies in Fort Smith. He ends up losing his job for a year and a half, almost 2 years. He ends up eventually getting to the point where other things have been going on. He's burnt out on Fort Smith, and I personally believe that he ends up becoming estranged from his wife then for the last few years of her life before she passes away. He's living down in Choctaw and Chickasaw Nation, close to Texas, and occasionally runs up to Fort Smith to bring prisoners up. But after this point, he ends up has to kind of figure out a new life for himself. His wife passes away, and then he ends up moving up to Tulsa. And so as a result of like starting to look at more of these stories about him, his sons, and how his family just literally broke up over time, one of the things a lot of people look at is he's this upright, God-fearing, black and white, law and order, justice, all-around good guy lawman that's just like almost a caricature of what I feel Bass Reeves really is. Who's like really this deep, conflicted character who did not have an easy life, did not see everything as black and white. And there's a number of stories that are told about his upbringing that as an enslaved person that I think are trying to make it sound much nicer than it was. So, I mean, there's a number of different stories, and there's a number of different things that the foremost Bass Reeves researcher, the guy, if somebody ever wants to learn about Bass Reeves, I highly recommend they read Bass Reeves' Black Gun Silver Star by Art Burton. Black Gun Silver Star is the name of the book. Art Burton is the author. I very definitely recommend that's the first book you read about Bass Reeves. Then you need to go through and reread it and figure out where to start splitting the stories up. Art and I are very good acquaintances. I respect a lot of his work. However, he and I disagree on, there's about 3 or 4 stories that he and I just don't talk about, just because I know that I'm not changing his mind despite what I know. No, during the time of the Civil War, Fort Smith just kept changing hands. The court in Fort Smith didn't exist. There was no marshal in Fort Smith during the Civil War. Many of the marshals in Confederate states during the Civil War, they basically left their positions. If they were U.S. aligned or Confederate aligned, they left their position either to go back north or to turn over to the Confederacy. There were Southern Confederate States of America marshals, essentially did the same job, different people, but the marshals essentially were not impacting any of the war. They were impacting places like Boston or Philadelphia or New York if there were sometimes like with draft riots or with elections, or if there were people who were seen as being sympathizers to the South, they would round them up. But they were not actively taking a role in any of that. Yeah, they wouldn't have been involved in any of the battles. The marshals were purely federal law enforcement, federal judiciary, just involved in the federal judiciary. They would not have been involved in the War Department, and it's very similar to, in kind of a correlation, during World War II, I've been asked by a number of people, like, well, what role did they play in the internment of the Japanese? They didn't. That was all FBI and military intelligence. It's just like if the federal court said you need to go do this, or if a person in federal office, president, U.S. Attorney General, had said you need to go do this, they'll have to go do that. But typically, a lot of the things that sometimes people think the marshals did, they wouldn't have been anywhere near because they just fell so far out of their jurisdiction.